From a collection of unmitigated pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret. A Trip Through Antarah ibn Shaddad. Victory Songs. This week, we are taking another trip through a medieval author, but quite a bit earlier, the end of the 6th century, and quite a bit further east, the Ethiopian-Arab warrior poet, Antarah ibn Shaddad. This trip ought to be read closely with the one that is going to follow it, Bertrand de Born. I flipped the order from my original intent. The similarities in values and vision between Bertrand and Antarah, both mounted military elites singing, with a mind to performance, about the experience of battle, are really striking, given the vast chronological, geographic, and cultural gulf that divides them, though they are hardly identical. But perhaps even more striking than the connections between the worlds of these elite cavalrymen is the vast chasm that separates their view of war from our own. And that's what we're going to look at today, how the poems of Antarah ibn Shaddad express a set of martial values, and how we can read a text like this to tease out a worldview and value system. A reminder before we begin that if you want to support this project and the rest of my research, you are encouraged to do so through my Patreon, where I also give additional monthly updates on my scholarly research and professional writing for patrons. In addition, if you would like to get email updates when there is new content here, you can click the button to subscribe. Finally, I suppose I must say before we begin, because this point is so frequently misunderstood, that we are reading these sources for the understanding, not for the endorsing. I do not share Antarah's valuation of war, or, for next week, Bertrand's either. And, even within the martial space, my sympathies are more often with the stoic valor of the common infantryman, entirely absent from Antarah's poetry, than the cavalryman's dash that he exhibits so strongly. A preference perhaps not surprising for a Roman specialist. But all of that is quite beside the point. The question is how people in a particular era of the past thought, not if I, or anyone now, agrees with them. To preempt the question, if you are curious about Roman military values, the best place to begin is J.E. Linden, Soldiers and Ghosts, 2005. This is, I think, the same species of blockheadedness that assumes that military historians study war because we like it, which is a bit of asinine stupidity that I still encounter from members of the Academy from time to time. Every modern military historian I know studies war for the same reason that doctors study illness, not because we like it, but so that we might have less of it. I should also note, thank you to the ISAW booth at this past SCS/AIA, where I acquired my copy of Antarah ibn Shaddad War Songs, translators James E. Montgomery and Richard Seiberth, 2018. But for them, I would not have known this existed, and could hardly have my own copy. Background. The author. We know a lot less about Antarah ibn Shaddad, Antarah, son of Shaddad, though it is not entirely clear if he is the son or grandson of this Shaddad. Note that Antarah's name is often spelled Antarah without the initial mark as well than we would like. He is an almost legendary figure as soon as he appears in our sources, roughly 2 centuries after he would have written. Antarah was born a slave. His mother seems to have been a captive, taken as a slave by his father from ACOUP. Our sources agree that Antarah was black, born to a black mother, raised in the Arab Banu Ab's tribe of his father. He lived in the second half of the 6th century, and his skill as a warrior allowed him to win his freedom, and even become a person of some import within his tribe. Image. Manuscript illustration of Antarah ibn Shaddad. Image description. Via Wikipedia. A manuscript illustration of Antarah ibn Shaddad. While Wikipedia gives no useful sourcing for the image, it is also the cover image of my volume of his work, which notes that it is an illustration from a 12th to 13th century Syrian manuscript of the Romance of Antarah. End of image description. The quality of Antarah's poetry was likely recognized at the time, but it is after his death, and with the flowing of high literature in the Abbasid court, that his poems and legends of his life enter the literary record, with Antarah known as one of the three Arab ravens of the pre-Islamic period, black warrior poets writing in Arabic and within the Arab poetic tradition. In the broader geopolitical background, we have to understand that the Arabia of the 6th century was a fracture zone between dueling empires and collapsing kingdoms. To the north, the remains of the Roman Empire were formed into a wealthy, powerful, and feisty Eastern Roman Empire, by no means satisfied with decline, which was engaged in a centuries-long conflict with the Sassanid Empire, an aggressive, powerful, and culturally vibrant empire. Both empires were multicultural and multi-religious, but with a single religious group running the show: Christians in the ERE, Zoroastrians in the Sassanid Empire. And both had a religiously based vision of universal authority, which were fundamentally incompatible with each other. The Roman-Sassanid Wars. Note, I profoundly dislike Wikipedia's classification, which splits Roman-Persian and Byzantine-Sassanid wars, rather than Roman-Parthian, Roman-Sassanid, running from 285 to the late 7th century. These were big wars, in which both the Romans and the Sassanids used their wealth and power to recruit entire tribes of Arabs to fight for them, sparking continuous proxy wars on their frontiers. Meanwhile, to the south, the decline of ACOUP in Ethiopia and Himyar in Yemen further stirred the pot and provided opportunities for raiding and further destabilization. Image. Map of the Middle East, roughly 500 AD. Image description. Via Wikipedia, a map of the situation, roughly 500 AD. This is mostly useful for a sense of where the Romans, Sassanids, Himyar, and Axumites are, as my understanding is that political affairs within Arabia proper were far more chaotic than the neat four-state Ghassanid, Lakhmids, Kinda, Hejaks distribution here implies. End of image description. In short, Antarah lived during a period when the normal background hum of warfare between Arab tribes, which, always a major facet of life, seems to have been accelerated by the violent context. The Arab tribes, while the term Arab may date to the 7th century BC, we should be cautious, as the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula, who I will refer to here as Arabs for simplicity, went by a number of names, and we should not underestimate the likely diversity within those groups. Were a mix of nomadic Bedouin and groups with more permanent settlements, which gave rise to further conflict. Within that context, we see the emergence of a mounted warrior elite as the leaders of tribal groups, which might be based on kinship, but also on friendship or comradeship. Antarah, from his humble beginnings, rose to be one of these mounted warrior elites by virtue of his own military skill, and his poetry reflects that. The genre. Antarah writes in a form of poetry called qasida. Like many poetic forms dealing with what a society views as high matters, it is an elaborate form with a single meter per poem and lines that all rhyme on the same sound. As an aside, this is a rule I find generally applicable, with some notable exceptions, over multiple cultures. The topics that are most valued by the elite tend to get rigid, elaborate, difficult forms that speak to the high value placed on them, while low or common matters get flexible, free-flowing forms that facilitate more personal expression. Thus, the contrast between Greek epic, high, and lyric, lower, or tragedy, high, and comedy, low. Medieval high literature goes in Latin, but even in the vernacular, note the contrast between the chanson and canso, high-middle, and the Cervantes, middle-low, We do the same things in our own art forms, of course. One does not film Dunkirk or 1917 the way one films Thor Ragnarok or Deadpool. This kind of poetry was fundamentally oral when it began, and was oriented towards performance, meaning recitation. The Qasida revolved around the concerns of elite warrior poets, manly virtue, honor, though also love, and the fierceness of kin bonds. Within that genre, the poems we are going to look at are victory songs, raucous celebrations of military success and the martial valor that earned it. The poems. Translators J.E. Montgomery and R. Seiberth. Original citation. Alas, my Arabic is very poor. I have a couple of semesters, but that was a long time ago, and I was never very good then either. So, I am working with this text entirely in translation. That caveat out of the way, I heartily recommend War Songs, cited above. These excerpts are just 2 of the 51 poems in the volume, and the introduction was also invaluable. Damn the ruins. Quote, "Damn the ruins. Damn you. Stop dwelling on the past again. Damn you. Stop all this talk. You won't ever get the sweet times back. At Al-Faruq we shielded our women, trampled the locust underfoot when the armies collided. No retreat, we swore. Our spears are from Rudena, hard iron to make you whine, like dogs at the sight of vipers. You bolted, rumps in the air like old camels, sniffing a corpse. Couldn't you see our spears protect us? You're not going to drool over our soft-necked gazelles. Still time takes us all. Death appeared. I said to my men, who's up for a wager? Who will face death with me? Turn your horses. The raiders are here. Don't let them win the prize. They met warriors, not slaves at Al-Faruq. We drive our horses hard, their manes matted like lice-ridden hair. Come back for more now that you know time damns us all." End quote. The Battle of Udair. Quote, "The Battle of Udair was a healing. Has she heard? Can my soul ever be cured? We came upon a mighty army, serried and drilled, bigger than a mountain and digging the trough of war. Our raid, a brutal storm of death, ended their despite. Charges of Mashraf blades and pliant Samhar spears took them by surprise. Nourished by grim battle swords, our wounds still fresh, we'll never cede to our foes. We line up our taut Radwa bows, grips groaning, arrows tapered, like tongues of Himyar leather. Let Kuda'a revel in glory. Our squadron stand ready, in Askaf and Raran, armor burnished, arrayed for battle, banners flapping, like vultures' shadows." End quote. The battle was a healing. We cannot, so far as I know, connect these poems to any particular known battle. These are not the massive engagements of the great dueling empires to the north. The first poem seems clearly a smallish raid, aiming to steal women and livestock. The former was clearly a constant concern. The possibility of the poet's own wife being abducted, should she neglect his warhorse, forms a motif of a later song. For the latter, the site Udair is too far south, close to modern Riyadh, if I am reading the map correctly. Instead, these poems relate much of the endemic small-scale raiding and counter-raiding, which defines non-state and proto-state warfare, especially among nomadic peoples. Instead of looking at these poems as a record of a historical event, I want to read them as evidence for a system of values, the same way we read Duoda of Uses. One easy trap for students of history to fall into is the assumption that people in the past share some key component of our values, typically because in our culture, that idea is rarely seriously questioned. One of these ideas, which has taken deep hold, is the conviction that war is bad. In particular, the view that war both not only destroys people and things, but that it also fundamentally corrupts, leaving those who experience it fundamentally damaged in a way that requires healing, if healing is even possible. I feel I should note here that this is a view that I largely agree with. War really is bad, especially modern war, with its much higher degree of destruction, but also pre-modern war. Much of the nobility of war values that we'll look at today and next week depend on a very narrow vision of humanity, as we'll see, one that excludes or devalues the non-elites who do most of the actual suffering and dying in most forms of pre-modern warfare. We'll get more into that next week with Bertrand de Born. But that vision of war, as fundamentally a process of damage, is quite modern. The current version of it is very directly a product of the literary and cultural response to World War I. Compare a modern war song, because I will take any chance to plug bands from Virginia, which actually uses a lot of the same techniques of vividness and an implied listener, but to very different effect. That set of values, war is bad, is contingent, a phrase we use to describe things which are not, in fact, inevitable or universal, though they may so seem to societies where they hold, but are instead dependent on certain circumstances, and thus crucially, things which are contingent might well be different with a different set of circumstances or a different time or different place. For Antarah, war is not damaging at all. It is healing and ennobling. War improves rather than destroys. In the first poem, it is the experience of battle and the call to hazard. Quote, "Who's up for a wager? Who will face death with me?" End quote. Which brings out the essential truth, a time comes for everyone motif, which opens the poem as the poet urges the subject, which in victory songs are usually the touted defeated enemy, to abandon their attachment to lost glories. Quote, "Damn the ruins," end quote. Which in turn enables the brave nobility, quote, "Come back for more," end quote, of the final line. Likewise in the second poem, the battle is a healing for Antarah's soul. It also ends the dispute, causes revelry, and the poem concludes with a description of the brilliant array of the cavalry, underscored by the brilliant juxtaposition of the shadow of the vultures who may feast on the corpses produced by this impressive array, which in turn echoes the presence of death of the first poem. Now, some of this we might attribute to the genre here, the victory song. These songs would have been performed by the poet, and you want to imagine them in the context of that sort of, probably quite raucous, live performance. Some of the verses seem like clear applause or cheer lines, with big, defiant, finishing flourishes. The implied subject of many of these songs is the defeated enemy, being taunted over his defeat. The songs revel in mocking a foe, no longer present to make his reply. And in that context, we might imagine Antarah to expand his achievements and his own valor. If he felt terror in battle or faltered, that would hardly be an appropriate note in such a victory song. Yet, speaking for a moment from a broad reading of martial literature, even within genre constraints, such literature tends to embody the values of its society. If war and battle were viewed ambiguously, we would see it. Consider the contrast with the ambiguity of war from the Iliad, a poem that, I think in the end, falls on the war is good side of the line, but drinks deeply of the sorrow of war before getting there. For Antarah, at least, war is not a complex, morally freighted thing. Success in war is an uncomplicated good, and no pity or remorse is spared for the vanquished. This is not, I must stress, some sort of unique product of a non-Western tradition. We will see next week a medieval French, Occitan to be precise, voice, presenting effectively the same vision. The temptation to orientalize this positive vision of war is a false one and must be resisted. And yet, for all of that, it is hard to miss that for Antarah, and indeed, as we'll see next week, for a great many historical cultures, war and battle were thought of not only as normal, but as potentially quite positive things. Now, we need to be clear with that statement that this isn't some sort of Star Trek mirror universe society, though Antarah is usually depicted with impressive facial hair. It is not that all, or even most, violence is viewed positively, but within a certain set of socially sanctioned bounds, in this case, the seemingly endless space for violence created by inter-clan feuding. Violence for Antarah is not a regrettable necessity, but a positive, unalloyed good. We drive our horses. Also relevant is the kind of violence that the poet places value on, because it isn't just any kind of warfare that Antarah celebrates. It is a very specific sort of warfare tied to a mounted, aristocratic elite. Through his poems, the us, alongside the poet, is always mounted. Their weapons, when described, are typically brilliant, imported weapons from places of renown. Rudena and Samhar spears, Radya bows with Heimyar leather. None of these are places within the typical ranging of Banu Abs. Elsewhere in the poems, Antarah describes his coat of mail, somewhat rusted from heavy use, his own sword, quote, never dented or dull, end quote, and other weapons. Such equipment, especially the mail, which was expensive, mark Antarah and his companions out as a member of the warrior elite. These are not poor fighters, nor marginal ones. It is not hard to imagine why the even more rarefied warrior aristocrats of the Abbasid court found this narrative to resonate so clearly. Their station is contrasted throughout the corpus with slaves. Enemies meet, quote, warriors, not slaves, end quote, as noted above. Elsewhere, a defeated enemy is described as grasping at spears like, quote, a slave girl gathering wood for a fire, end quote. The possibility of the abduction and enslavement of the tribe's women, in particular, but even of warriors like Antarah himself, stalks many of the war poems. It seems a bitter irony that Antarah, born in the slaves' lot, nevertheless expresses no real empathy for them, but rather shows a sort of elite disdain for them. But that's actually fairly common for slave-holding societies. See, for example, for instance, the Song of Grypus, the slave fisherman in Plautus's Rudens, where Grypus, imagining he has come into a great fortune, immediately thinks of the slaves he will buy once he is free. To add another layer to that, it is often thought that Plautus's self-mocking name, it means flat-footed, is indicative that he too was a slave or a freedman. But it seems to me that the motif of the slave serves as the counterpoint for Antarah's warrior elites. It is always worth remembering that the chivalrous, a word quite a few commentators apply to Antarah, warrior codes, would never apply to most of us, but rather were meant for our betters. Image. Shahnameh illustration. Image description. Potential anachronism note. This is an illustration from the 1568 Shahnameh, showing the 636 Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, which I am using to illustrate mounted warfare in the late 500s. The reticence of early Muslim artists to depict human figures makes finding period depictions of warfare very difficult. But I think it does a great job of demonstrating how mounted military aristocrats tend to airbrush the infantry out of the narrative. Here, we have what appears to be a near total cavalry engagement, which it most certainly wasn't, as both armies were mostly infantry by raw numbers. End of image description. In the same vein, it is not surprising that one specific kind of martial valor is commemorated here, that of the mounted aristocrat. The set of equipment and weapons is neatly consistent from poem to poem. The bow and spear, wielded from horse or camel back, the sword as a backup weapon. As we'll see even more clearly next week, elite military readers often minimize or even entirely exclude less prestigious warriors from visual or narrative commemoration. Infantry do not vanish from the battlefields of horse-born aristocrats, but they do vanish from their literature and artwork. Likewise, the system of military values that Antarah presents are themselves contingent on the kind of warfare he is elevating. It is the individual skill of the mounted warrior that Antarah singles out for praise, not the clever general or the careful organizer or the stoic infantryman. Indeed, the cavalryman's dash often lionizes such things, the reckless assault, the swift and skilled feinted retreat, which would be cowardly or fatal to the infantry, and as a consequence are often not lionized by infantry-centric systems of martial values. The Greeks, for example, Herodotus, Demosthenes, have unkind words for the sort of fighter with this kind of dash, who attacks and retreats readily. Reading war literature widely is a helpful reminder that there is more than one set of martial values, despite the fact that writers within these traditions, and readers within ours, often represent this or that set of martial values as universal. What does Antarah value in his mounted aristocrat? There's little place for stratagem or the stoic courage of standing one's ground here. All of the honor is in the attack, fearless and brutal. And while most martial systems value aggression, understandably, here it is relatively untempered by discipline, unit cohesion, careful plans, or doctrine. That isn't to say it is unthinking. I've alluded to cavalry dash as distinct from other martial values, that the courage demanded of a cavalry charge is not the same as that demanded of infantry, made to stand under fire or to receive a charge. And this strikes me as being of a piece with that sort of ethos. At the same time, it is not the attack and retreat of the steppe. One poem concludes, quote, "Cowards run, I stand my ground," end quote. And Antarah at multiple points invites death over retreat. Most of all, Antarah values the attachment to his clan or tribal group. In one poem, he defiantly concludes that, quote, "My mother descended from Ham, but my father's the finest of the clan," end quote. Contrasting the low birth of his mother to the high status of his father. The Banu Abs features frequently in the poems, its glory celebrated or its honor defended. Describing a victorious raid, Antarah recounts, quote, "The swords of the Abs answered each other, Indian blades severing skulls," end quote. And elsewhere, quote, "In war my clan are the finest raiders, gripping the reins in the hands that killed Lakit and Ibn Hurj, Hajib and the sons of Aban," end quote. The ties of clan dominate the poems to the exclusion of all others, except perhaps the ties between Antarah and his women. A topic of considerable interest on the corpus of poems in its own right, I cannot say I found Antarah's attitude towards any of the women, either of opposing tribes or his own, particularly endearing. Conclusions. There is a lot more of interest in Antarah's poems. We have here, for instance, focused almost entirely on martial values, at the expense of the other great theme of the work, Antarah's love for Ablah. And there are running themes throughout the poems: the desert, the role of time and its expression as death, and the promise of timelessness through deeds and song, which are obvious enough that I picked them up even as a non-specialist in this literary tradition, and which would reward discussion in their own right. At the same time, the values in Antarah's war poetry also echo in their own way. Antarah's poetry seems to have mostly laid dormant during the 7th and early 8th centuries, as pre-Islamic poetry was eclipsed by the emergence of Islamic culture. And then, In the Abbasid court of the late 8th and 9th century, it was rediscovered and included in the period's growing interest in a pre-Islamic literary and poetic canon. Montgomery and Seiberth attribute this to the re-emergence of clan rivalries, with the collapse of unified Umayyad control, that the return to clan warfare suddenly made the bold, fearsome, and fiercely clan-loyal Antarah a relevant model of military masculinity in the Abbasid court. Though, subsequent generations of court scholars, they imply, become more interested in narrative as context to poetry and put more effort into trying to excavate Antarah's life from his poems. Consequently, Antarah's poetry serves two purposes: casting light both on the culture that created it, but also the later culture that, having rediscovered his poems, deemed them worthy of commemoration, speaking to a set of military ideals. And for that reason, and several others, the poetry of Antarah ibn Shaddad is well worth the trip. This has been a recording from a collection of unmitigated pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret, recorded by myself, A Great Divorce, for accessibility and sharing purposes. If you enjoyed this content and wish to engage with it or support Bret, please check the description for links to the original post on his blog, his Twitter, and his Patreon. I highly encourage you to share, support, and engage with his works on any and all platforms if you are so inclined. If you wish to support me, please do remember to like, share, and subscribe to this or any other content here that you enjoy. Thank you so much for listening.